Okay, let's dive right into this explainer on one of the absolute most bizarre and deadly industrial disasters in American history. You know, when we think of massive catastrophes, we're usually picturing fires, huge floods of water, or explosions. But syrup? Yeah, seriously. So, to understand exactly how a seemingly harmless baking ingredient literally destroyed an entire Boston neighborhood, we've got to jump back to 1919. World War I had just wrapped up, and Boston's North End was this incredibly bustling, densely populated area. And crucially, industry and residential life were sitting dangerously close to one another, like right on top of each other. And we are talking about a deadly wave of syrup moving through these city streets at an astonishing 35 miles per hour. Let that sink in. That is significantly faster than a human being can sprint. Now, how on earth does a highly viscous liquid move that fast? Well, we're going to get into the fascinating science of that in just a few minutes. But first, we really need to look at the actual source of this disaster. Part 1. A sweet, deadly setup. We're looking at the building of a literal ticking time bomb. To set the scene, let's look at the massive Purity Distilling Company tank sitting there in the North End. This wasn't some small storage vat. This was a towering industrial behemoth looming right over a neighborhood right adjacent to the Boston Harbor. The sheer scale of this thing was genuinely terrifying. It stood 50 feet tall, 90 feet across, and it held up to 2.3 million gallons of molasses. And no, they weren't hoarding this just for baking cookies. This molasses was primarily being fermented to produce ethanol, which, at the time, was a huge active ingredient in both alcoholic beverages and munitions. Now consider the immense weight of all that liquid. It's packing just a massive amount of potential energy waiting to be unleashed. Because molasses is actually about 40% denser than water. So sitting inside this giant metal cylinder was roughly 13,000 tons of incredibly heavy syrup, basically just waiting for a catastrophic failure. And the wild part is the company was rushing production to outrun prohibition, fatally ignoring all the warning signs along the way. I mean, the tank was built in 1915 and it leaked literally from day one, but they were racing against the clock. So on January 14th, 1919, they pumped a fresh, warm load of molasses into the cold tank. The very next day, the tank completely ruptures. And get this, the day after that, the 18th Amendment was ratified. They were just trying to produce as much alcohol as humanly possible before the law changed, and it ultimately cost people their lives. Part 2. The wave strikes Boston on January 15th, 1919. The crucial moment of failure happened right at 12:30 p.m. on an unseasonably warm winter day. Temperatures in Boston had rapidly climbed past 40 degrees Fahrenheit from the frigid days just prior. This caused the cold, older molasses to mix with the warm new batch, expanding and building up immense pressure until the stressed metal finally gave way. Eyewitness accounts describe this horrifying sensory experience. The sweet smell in the air was instantly followed by explosive destruction. People said they felt the ground violently shake. They heard this deep, growling rumble, almost like an elevated train passing by, which was then followed by a massive thunderclap. And that machine gun sound they reported hearing, that was literally the steel rivets violently shooting out of the tank seams. So the tank collapses, and all that potential energy translates into a towering 25-foot wave of molasses. It completely swept nearby buildings right off their foundations and crushed them. The force was so immense, it actually drove heavy steel panels from the tank straight into the adjacent elevated railway, momentarily tipping a streetcar completely off its tracks. There's this gripping, honestly terrifying report from the Boston Post that described this scene. It read, "Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared." People and animals were swept up in this bubbling, waist-deep swirl, desperately struggling to breathe as the incredibly thick liquid just filled the streets. Part 3. The science of syrup, and exactly why it was so deadly. Now, you might be wondering how on earth syrup could be this destructive. It feels pretty counterintuitive, right? Well, let's break down the actual physics here to understand exactly why this wave was so uniquely lethal. It comes down to this. Molasses is a non-Newtonian fluid. Because of that, the immense pressure of the bursting tank caused the liquid to thin out and travel at terrifying speeds. Unlike water, which flows at a constant rate, the massive weight and stress of the bursting tank caused the molasses to undergo what scientists call shear thinning. Under that kind of extreme pressure, it acts completely unlike the sticky syrup you pour on your pancakes. This created an inescapable trap. In fact, a 2016 Harvard study confirmed this was a deadly 1-2 punch. The wave moved fast enough to sweep people up initially, but then it thickened incredibly quickly as it cooled, trapping them in this smothering goo. As the molasses spread out into the winter air, it cooled rapidly, lost all that shear thinning effect, and instantly became highly viscous and gelatinous.
Part 4. Rescue and Sticky Cleanup. The Immediate Aftermath.
The scene right after the collapse was absolute chaos. Rescuers were plunging into waist-deep muck, literally fighting against this hardening sludge to save their neighbors. It took immense, incredibly brave human effort to save lives in a disaster zone where victims were literally glazed over and completely unrecognizable. 116 cadets from a training ship docked nearby were the very first on the scene, just wading straight into knee-deep syrup. Red Cross nurses dove right into the mess without hesitation, and doctors frantically set up makeshift hospitals. The final toll was devastating, though. 21 lives were lost, 150 people were injured, and the rescue effort took 4 grueling days. And the cleanup? It took hundreds of people weeks to clear the area. They actually had to bring in fireboats to pump saltwater directly from the harbor just to begin washing away the molasses. Then, sand was thrown all over the streets to absorb it, but that sticky residue got tracked absolutely everywhere, onto subway platforms, into homes, onto payphones. For decades after the flood, locals swore that the North End still smelled of molasses on really hot summer days. Part 5. The Trial and Legacy, where corporate greed meets modern regulation. Let's explore how this bizarre tragedy actually revolutionized corporate accountability in construction laws in the United States, because it was a major catalyst for fundamental safety changes. An auditor uncovered a truly shocking trail of negligence by a man named Arthur Jackslell. He was a treasurer with absolutely zero engineering experience, yet he was the one who oversaw the tank's construction. And the negligence was staggering. The steel they used was half as thick as it should have been, and it lacked manganese, which made it highly brittle. And when it predictably started leaking, instead of fixing it, the company literally painted the tank brown just to hide the leaks from the public. They completely ignored the groaning noises the tank made when filled, brushing off these glaringly clear acoustic warnings of structural fatigue. At first, the company actually tried to blame the disaster on anarchists, which is wild. But 119 residents brought a milestone class action lawsuit against them, and they ultimately won $628,000 in damages. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to nearly $12 million today. It became one of the first major class action suits in Massachusetts and an absolute landmark case in corporate regulation. So, the most important takeaway from this explainer is that the modern building codes keeping our cities safe today, they were essentially paid for by the victims of the Great Molasses Flood. Before this event, an untrained treasurer could just oversee a massive industrial tank towering over a city block. Afterward, sweeping legal changes required that licensed architects and civil engineers oversee all massive construction projects. It was a real game changer. But it does leave us with a haunting question. If it took a literal tsunami of syrup to create these vital safety laws, what overlooked dangers are we unknowingly walking past right now? The people of Boston walked past that leaking brown tank every single day without realizing the massive potential energy waiting inside. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the world around you.